You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian Ghetto.
Hello, Johan. Let me add you now. Add as speaker. Invite as co-host. There we go. All right. Welcome, Black Horse. There we go. Invite to speak. And then...
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'll make you a co-host too. That way we got three of us here.
There you go.
We
may not have an audience, but we have
we got one.
There you go.
Yeah. Chris Burnett said he was going to come too. So.
Who's Chris Burnett?
Is it Chris Burnett? Let me just see if I make sure I get the name right. Yeah, Chris Burnett. He runs the KarlStack Substack.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and he had me on a while back and said that when I sent it out, he said, "Oh, I'll be there." So
there you go.
There we go. Okay, we are recording, so we can start anytime if we want to, and then others can re-listen to when we're all done if they want to re-listen to it. So we are here talking about community and alternative community and building it and fostering it, and the logic of it and why we do it, and maybe we'll let Johan start just introducing the topic to us. One of the things that spurred this conversation and why I wanted to have it with Johan is that he wrote a piece a while back about fostering a new alternative elite. And one of the points that Johan made is that it's not enough just to merely say, hey, we need new elites, but we need to give them a new and different incentive system other than the one of the regime, and give them a goal to aspire to, something to build for, something that they will find rewarding, that will entice them away from what they are currently doing towards working on this project of building parallel communities that can offer meaningful resistance to the regime.
Hi, Kroptos.
Hello.
No, listen, it's fantastic to speak to you in person. We've been moving in the same circles for a while.
It is really good. I've been looking forward to this.
Definitely. Sure. I mean, I'll give my 2 cents on what we're doing here. So I wrote a very long time ago an article called Dissidents with Elite Potential Must Join Liberal Organizations. And my point in that article was pointing out that the best companies at the moment for maturing talent, the best organizations, tend to be very liberal. And there is an argument, in my view, for even if you are from a dissident disposition, a Christian, a traditional Catholic, whatever it is, there is an argument to be made in terms of pure self-development to spend a period at one of these institutions. I got some pushback on that article. Some people disagreed, some people violently agreed, and so forth. But one of the interesting lines of criticism I got was, well, this is a great shame if this is true, because many of the people that are least able to flourish under, the sort of progressive indoctrination policies that a lot of these organizations have are the most intelligent, because they are able to perceive exactly what's going on. They have these ideas about the way society should be, and rather than the ideas which are being pushed onto them, they're more difficult to indoctrinate. And the argument that was put to me was, look, wouldn't it be great if instead of relying on these liberal organizations as sort of talent incubators, even if it is only for a short period, what would it take to pull elites out of those sort of liberal machines, potential elites, young elites that are well disposed towards us and our political views, our sort of spiritual views of the world and so forth? What would it take to keep them and to build actual communities, ecosystems of businesses, organizations, perhaps higher educational organizations and so forth? And so the piece that you're referencing was an attempt at beginning to hash out what would be necessary, the infrastructure that would be necessary to do that. It included motifs around talent development, prestige, recognition, recognition of the centrality of the mission as a motivating factor for young individuals of this kind. But anyway, so that was how I think I began thinking about this question of why dissident communities are necessary. Obviously, a dissident community, in the true sense, in the sense that you might think about the Amish or certain Orthodox Jewish communities, certain Mormon communities, and so forth, are much more well-rounded, holistic sets of institutions than just networks of businesses. And so perhaps today we can get into, why these dissident communities more broadly defined are necessary, what would be the necessary constituent components of a belief system that could support an activity as radical as that. And in my view, and I suspect yours, faith is a necessary component of that, how to maintain the integrity of these networks and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean, as I made the argument recently on Oran's show that, you really, the technical administrative system is what it is. And as you say, there is a certain value moving and being in elite circles because you can learn things. You can learn skills that they have. You can learn the ins and outs of how it works. And what it takes to succeed in these organizations and the reward structures. But one of the things that, Alul observed is that the very nature of the technical system as a fact and its internal logic and dynamic means that it becomes really difficult to wield it towards any other purposes than for its own ends, which typically tend to be progressive because of sort of the iterative nature of technique. Always want to be, that sort of constant step-by-step improvement and process working on that sort of thing. And so you either come to the conclusion, either you have to sort of go the full Ted Kaczynski route and bring the whole system down, the end of modernity, which is from a cost-benefit perspective seems very unpalatable. And I'm just, I don't think, I'm not a utopian, so the cost benefit thing doesn't really work for me, and I don't think it's a proper Christian perspective. That means then you sort of have to sort of look at, so what's our alternative? And then door number 3 becomes very much a reality. In a sense, we build an alternate community that either waits until the regime fails and then is there to pick up the pieces, or perhaps is ready at a crucial time to do sort of a both and, be there to pick up the pieces and maybe give it that final shove and push over, So then that for me is kind of the logic. And when you look at how the state has developed, it has set itself up as an ontological reality, metaphysical, in a sense that it wants to, it pushed Christianity out of the public realm, and then assumed the metaphysical reality that God used to occupy in people's lives. And so essentially we're fighting a religious war. And so you basically have to recognize it's sort of God versus Pharaoh, the living God versus the usurper God. And fundamentally, the struggle becomes a religious battle. And so you have to address it as such. And really within the West, the only meaningful religious entity in that sense is Christianity. And so it really becomes, in some ways, a battle between Christianity and the regime. And I think that's, for me, is how I have come to see it in that regard. However, it plays out politically. And so that sort of centers for me, then, the building of community is around faith. But then there is, as you say, all these other issues as well, too. I know, Blackheart, you've had some thoughts on this before that you've shared with me in a previous space, and maybe you want to chime in too as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of layers to this that I think we're underplaying. First of all, whether you want to or not, the regime is aggressively pushing people like us out of institutional power. So if you want to take up your proper role as a leader in society, you have no choice but to do so in a parallel community. You will not be allowed to play that role inside progressive institutions. Whether you think it would be good leadership development or not, you're not going to be allowed in. So
you don't get a seat at the table. Yeah.
Well, I mean, look at Canada. It's functionally illegal to be a practicing Christian and be a member of many elite institutions.
Yes.
I was stupid enough not to know that when I was a teenager, but I know it now. And so, like, the question of whether it would be better to participate in the elite institutions of our broad culture or not, it is kind of an academic question at this point. I suspect that the story is very similar in South Africa, where if you're of a certain ethnic makeup, you're not allowed in official elite institutions, so you have to have your own, whether you want to or not. This is increasingly the case in countries that are beginning to make the transition from sort of soft persuasion in progressivism to hard persuasion in progressivism. So that's element number one. Element number two is, well, what's the fundamental problem with the regime? Well, one of the fundamental problems with the regime is that the elites have no bond with their people. And so why create parallel communities? Well, one reason is to create a society where elites have a deep and spiritual bond with the people that they lead, which can only be forged through being of them and one with them. So you can't go and spend 20 years working, working in Progland and then come back to your community and expect to share a deep spiritual bond and be able to lead them. That's not the way things work. You have to be of them and with them in order to have the kind of loyalty to demand the kind of sacrifices that will be needed in the years ahead. And then reason number three is that participating in the broad culture, it's just impossible not to get it on you. So even if you could bypass the gatekeeping mechanisms and participate in prog culture, you would have to live your life, as the PMC, as a kind of greengrocer, putting up the sign and hiding all day long. And it's impossible to do that, keep your integrity, and raise your children in your own tradition. So your parallel community, even if you're personally, emotionally capable of doing that, the transmission to your children is a big problem. So parallel community becomes essential in that piece. And then I think the interesting discussion is to look at, well, parallelism is a new idea for preserving the indigenous cultures of the West, religious or otherwise. That's gone better and worse for different groups across the West, and maybe it's interesting to look at some of the comparative successes and failures.
I think you're both exactly right to take this right to the heart of the matter straight away. Karlstack, when you pointed out that, as Alil says, there is no reworking of the current technical infrastructure to our advantage. This is a much more fundamental question than that because of the logic of the current technical infrastructure. And Black Horse, when you talk about the centrality of spiritual leadership and the proximity of that leadership in spiritual terms to the people, one thing that immediately springs to mind that is kind of a curious little case study is right-wing opposition to the modern movement for quote-unquote livable cities. And I think that implicit in that, on the surface, that sounds like an idea that elements of at least conservatives, if not the actual right wing, might be amenable to, these kind of small communities in which you can walk around without the help of technology and you can know your neighbor and so forth. But I think a lot of the resistance to that senses that this is an attempt to rearrange technical, physical infrastructure without resolving and indeed completely ignoring the most fundamental issues of who is in your community, where they come from, what they believe. And if you don't resolve those issues first, you worsen the problem. Because livable cities, which remove infrastructure for cars, make it more difficult to network with the people who you actually care about, who may be further away. And, as infrastructure continues to degrade and the bizarre social engineering programs of the regime continue, an essential protection for our way of life will be to physically convene with those with whom we share the most, and to carve out a place for those values which we hold most dear. So completely agreed that fundamentally the first question to resolve is the spiritual one. What is your telos, and not the technical one of how you are going to achieve this.
Yes, that makes really good sense too, and then layering that, because we talk about a different organizing principle. So we're core. We're building it around renewed spiritual values. There is the sense that both on left and the right, as Augusto Del Noce talks about, that both left and right, so both your Marxist and your fascist, root themselves in a post-Nietzschean world, right? So you have two utopian type dreams. One is to sweep away the current order or tradition, and you have a future utopia. The other is to build sweep away the current order and reach back into the past at some sort of past utopia and reinstantiate that. Both end up doing so largely through technical and policy means. So they use the same mechanisms, and then because of the nature of technique, end up being functionally the same thing. I know people have a hard time struggling with that, but fascism and Marxism in the end up being the same thing. Just their definition of utopia is different, right? And so what Del Noce argues is that what we're really looking for is to find a different source. And he says, well, what is that source? It really comes back to a living relationship with a living God. It's not sort of Christianity as formalism, going to church or whatever, but he's talking about really, in a sense, a mystical connection with a living God, that people begin to actually reconnect with God, but they do so within the confines of Christian tradition, right? So it's rooted with something, it's grounded in something, it's something living, and then this gives you a new basis, recognizing the division between, because it's not utopian, that the original sin that we can only achieve so much in this world.
You're discussing a particular mechanism of governing a particular parallel community. I would assume that the struggle of this space is to talk about the challenges of separation in order to establish.
And that was, I guess, what just sort of a long lead up into the sort of the next thing, because you're not then, as this sort of new source, you're not offering the same rewards that the technical system does, which is great at providing power and money. And so in some sense, you have to conceive of how to attract people where power and money are not your two main allures, right? And so that's perhaps really the challenge that way. Is it in a sense that you're giving them a shared vision of building something?
You have to recognize that in order to succeed in building parallel communities, you have to attract high status young men. And in order to do that, you have to offer them the opportunity to be at the top of a dominance hierarchy that rewards them. That's how young men work. That's how they've always worked. That's how they always will work. And so the issue is, what does the regime do in order to get them there? Well, it offers them money, and it offers them political power inside the global system. Well, you can't do that.
No.
But you can still offer them status. And you can offer them status in all sorts of ways that the regime is incapable of offering them status. My favorite illustration of this is that, sure, Jeff Bezos can be the richest man in the world, have $100 billion, but he can't stop his ex-wife from taking 20 billion of it. Sure, Elon Musk can be the world's richest man, but he still has, children being raised to hate him. Right? There are things that we can offer. And so to this end, if you are interested in building parallel community, you should actually spend a great deal of time talking about the ways in which the status offered by the regime is, it's like chasing after smoke. You can't actually hold it because they demand that you don't have authority even in your own home, much less in your own. It's it's illusory at this really deep level, right?
Yes. Yeah, and there's a lot of age-old stories that, there's the one that Jesus tells of the man who builds, who says to himself, I'm going to build another barn to hold all of my grain. And the Lord says, well, that's good for you to have those plans, but tonight, your life is in my hands. and but the question, I guess, then really becomes, how do you cast that vision? Like, and how do you put meat on the bones of what that vision is going to look like, in a sense of, like, what are we actually trying to build,
Well,
and what are these young men who are going to be at the top of this hierarchy, what are we going to be asking them to build and make? And one of the questions I asked in our notes with Johan before coming up is, do we, because we're organizing as Christians, in a sense, because of the current political system, does this necessarily politicize it, or does this give us an opportunity for Christians to unite under a banner? And does the political become a catalyst for Christian union? And then, if we're building a fully formed community, what are the pieces that we then need to build a society that is in the world but not of the world, but yet is a full and complete society?
So there's a lot on that question.
There is.
Well, I would say, first and foremost, the thing that sprung to mind when you were discussing Marxism and fascism and their unsuitability for this moment, the first thing to notice is that those are sort of totalizing ideologies, right? So they attempt, either within the confines of the national state or within the confines of the international workers' movement, to totalize the uptake of their ideology. That's very clearly unsuitable for the moment, because we're not going to capture the totality of the system, especially with the radical beliefs of the kind we have. And so it is about forming separate communities, and that's one of the reasons that I think a faith of some kind, whether Christian or not, is going to be an essential component of this. One of the things that I think is very useful about, I'll discuss Christianity because that's my faith, but you could interpret this more broadly, about following a faith of this kind, is that all right-wing movements like ours are fundamentally anchored around hierarchy and order. And if you require a fundamentally separate hierarchy to be set up, Christianity helps very much, because you immediately out of the box have institutions and an understanding of values that allows you to orient that hierarchy. And if you think about what we're actually seeing on the ground here, it is difficult to ignore the fact that religiosity of some form will be necessary when the successful communities of this kind that have already been launched. I'm happy to hear counterexamples, but the Amish.
No, they're all religious communities, and they're all radical religious communities.
Right, exactly. And I think that religiosity has a particular advantage, exactly as you say, in unlocking radicalism within the boundaries of something that can be controlled and held together. In some sense, the more radical the faith, the better when embarking on a project as grand as this, the formation of an entirely new community. But you are still going to have to maintain community integrity. One of the really interesting things that Kraptos spoke about in one of the pieces that he suggested as pre-reading for this was that fundamentally a large part of the project is necessarily, in order to support community, going to be the reimposition of bonds on people, obligations, duties that they have simply been freed from under liberalism. And so the question of how to summon radical energy of the kind of people that will give their lives to in a structured and mutually supportive way is an incredibly difficult one to solve, I would say, outside the bonds of organized faith.
Yes, because you're basically, to use an example, one of the places where you see this type of thing developing is perhaps in the monastery, right? Where you submit your spiritual guidance to the abbot. And there's a clear order, rule, and hierarchy, and there's a very clear purpose of intent. And as you say, Johan, these are ideas that, when you're raised on a culture of unchosen bonds, unlimited speech, unlimited action, where people tell you, what happens in my own bedroom is nobody's business, is a massive culture shock. To come in to say that, listen, you are going to become a part of this project. You're going to be asked to find your place in the hierarchy, submit to it, and this is a good thing for your own benefit and for ours. And for people to embrace that is a massive culture shift. And you start small, but the thing is that we want this thing to grow, to become substantial enough that the regime deems us a threat.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, and one of the things I really liked about your article on the loss of community was that it was completely unflinching in tying the loss of community to the erosion of duties, rules, and obligations that underpin the dynamics of those communities. And if you want a community, then you must accept commensurate limitations.
Okay, but all of this discussion remains about the characteristics of the community you're trying to build. I mean, obviously, we want to build a community that reimposes bonds of hierarchy on the people within it, because all healthy communities have those bonds, right?
Yes.
Obviously, we want to create a community that has a dedication to God. The question is, how you have a system that is explicitly designed to deracinate particularly young men from their community and pull them in as satraps of the regime, right? So the question is, how do you begin constructing a parallel community that prevents their loss and instead presses them into service of their own people, right? That bonds them in an irrevocable way to that community. The question is not exactly what will that community look like. That's a question that actually properly belongs to the people who form that community. It's not a question. You don't actually start with a vision of what the community will look like. You start by collecting the men you can collect, right?
Yes, because it has, because again, the regime is all system, right? It's, you can't, and that's the challenging thing, because if you have another plan, you're just another systems developer, right?
The defining character of the communities that we want to create is the spiritual bond between people and leadership class.
And it's grounded organic nature.
That's right. And so in order to do that, you need to think first about who are the people that you're trying to lead? How are you going to create a leadership class that is suitable for that community and make sure that they become bonded to their client class? How are you going to make that community durable against both efforts at deracination and shocks, right? How are you going to make sure that when things get economically difficult for example, whites in South Africa, that they don't just leave and go to the United States or somewhere else? How do you ensure that at a generational level they continue? These are the actual questions you're dealing with, rather than the questions of what the system specifically will look like.
Well, here was something too, like as Charles Haywood in his recent piece was talking about. Because I guess it comes to the question is what does the regime do in a sense? What's the trade-off for the power and the money? Is that it alienates you from God, and it alienates you from the physical world. Right, so in a sense, I guess I'm just spitballing here.
That's the old trade, but then the new trade is not only does it do that, but you get to genetically die, and you get to, watch your life become this. Like, I mean, does Elon Musk have a beautiful life? No, I don't want that life, right? And so how do you keep your people in? Well, that actually got a lot easier in the last 20 years. Now the question is, how do you rebond these people groups that have survived into modernity with their natural elites? How do you educate their natural elites? how do you start laying the foundations for institutions to represent them and defend those communities?
So
Go ahead.
This is interesting to me. I mean, because this sounds like the first major point of disagreement. You are thinking at a far more macro level than I am in, what I'm doing in my own life. And you're thinking about saving a people, which implies the coherency of a people that I actually don't think we have in many countries in the West, or even in many regions in countries in the West. So when I want to start a small community, a parallel community, I really mean start, I don't want to attempt to retie the...
Yeah, whereas Cryptos and I are talking about a couple of specific communities that exist, that have survived modernity so far, and are basically leaderless. And we're talking about rebuilding them.
So here's why I draw out this distinction, though. It's that naturally this is an incredibly challenging project. And I think the danger of both starting the question very big, which is reattaching existing communities to their elites, while also drawing in the huge number of questions that will have to be contended with, everything from economic to geographic to identity issues all at once, makes this seem like a project of almost unassailable scale. And that's why what I was attempting to outline a few minutes ago was just outlining at first the very high level universal structural factors that you're going to contend against. And actually, exactly as you say, it's going to be a set of incentive issues for people to participate in the system, and it's going to be a set of obligations and costs, which you will also have to navigate. And I have some thoughts as to what those are, but I want to make sure we're on the same page.
Well, yeah, no, it's good because I tend to be, I think, somewhat in between as somebody who's grown up in a very distinct ethno-religious community that, as Black Horse says, lacks high-level leadership. Part of me wonders whether...
Well, it also lacks confidence in itself, which is the other...
That's true.
Like, that's the other really big issue with these communities that have survived into modernity. When they've come into conflict with the progressives that lead the nations that they're in, because they haven't had a leadership class, because they have no confidence to bargain on their own behalf, right?
Yeah, well, see, and in this sense where what I think I hear Johan talking about is to say, hey, listen, okay, good, you've got some of these existing communities, that's great, but really we need to sort of take a step back and perhaps begin not with the existing communities, but to find people within those communities and begin quietly networking them together. If I'm reading you right, Johan, and then just slowly from the ground up, then it emerges from these early networks. If that's correct.
I'm saying you have to run this like a startup, not like turning around a large business. So,
yes.
For example, if you look at someone like Doug Wilson, right, in Moscow, Idaho. For those not familiar, he's a conservative pastor who others will frankly know better than me, but I'm aware of the high level story of his. He landed in a small college town, right, which is overwhelmingly liberal.
Well, but he didn't land there. His father established the church there with the direct intent like 40 years ago. Right. So you're looking, when you see Doug Wilson, you're looking 40 years into the project.
But that's my point, right, which is that he didn't land in a town, or his father didn't land in a town in which there was a natural class of Christians that were just waiting to be reunited with leadership. He landed, in a sense, in hostile territory, right? So he had to start very small, a very particular germ, and grow that over decades and decades into a flourishing community almost out of nothing. It wasn't a retethering of a lost Christian community to the local sort of elites that they had been disconnected from. It was a project literally from the ground up. And I would observe that the same pattern has been repeated. If you looked at the original Jewish farmsteaders in Palestine, they started incredibly small, and it was this gradual wave that built up, and so on and so forth. But I think that my recommendation really would be to start even at the level of a single church. It wouldn't be to embark on any near-term time frame, absent a really large revolution in civilization that was a sort of civilizational destabilizing effect that had people desperately looking for new leadership in a way that I frankly don't think many people are at the moment, even if they feel something is very off.
Yeah, it just, it underscores just listening to all of us talk, and we do talk about this, and even if we have a sense of it, and even if we've experienced some of it, what a daunting project it is. And not to say that we shouldn't begin, but it does underscore, in a sense, the point that Heidegger makes about the technical system of just how inframing it is. That, it's almost like within the technical system, sort of we live and move and have our being these days, right? And we're really trying to, in a sense, break free, ground ourselves, and plant something and begin again. And it's like, I know for myself, it's like, wow, the whole thing just feels very overwhelming. It's beyond me to do. But somehow, somewhere, we have to start with something and plant somewhere. And begin, like you say, the example of Doug Wilson, who's done it, who's built an alternate community. It can be done. And then they can be networked together. But, a clarity of vision and a real understanding of what we're about and why we're there.
Right. I mean, I think that upfront question of who we are, what we believe, frankly, what our dogmas are, what we're doing this for, what our mission is essential to lay out in ahead of time. And the reason for this is, I think one of the key mechanisms for, exactly as Black Horse says, one of the primary challenges you're going to come up against is the discomfort of joining the community is going to cause gradual erosion and dissent of some of your most valuable people outside of the community. So the question is, what are the confines, what are the structures you can put in place in order to prevent that from happening? And in my opinion, part of that is going to be having a set of central, inviolable understandings that define the borders of this community. And it's going to be a set of beliefs. And if you excuse yourself, or if you attempt to excuse yourself from even one of these beliefs, that's fine, but everyone must understand you're leaving. And conversely...
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The
The
center of building something like this is church discipline, right? So you violate the sacred rules of the community, you're gone. The end. No discussion.
Yeah, and like I definitely agree. And for all that people knock on Rod Dreher and so forth, I think that one of the things that he did get really right in his book, The Benedict Option, was to highlight the rule of Benedict as an establishment of a political order within the monastery. As Johann says, an inviolable political order. You go in, you take a vow, right? And then you join the order. And, there's even that waiting period, the novitiate, right? Where, you go in and the question is this really for you? Do you really have what it takes to become part of this thing that is being built? And if you do, then fine, you'll be allowed to take your vows. But others will evaluate your commitment to the project. And then they will either, allow you to pass in, or that, and then, if you leave, then you leave and you're done. You're out, right? And and there's also, again, as you were saying, Black Horse, like real, discipline becomes a thing. But not only that, even if you have like a network of communities, and this is, I think, one of the problems that we have today, is even if you don't have like a universal global structure, you have a series of network communities. If you join our community and you walk away, you don't get to go to the next town and join their community.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues here is prestige mechanisms that are not connected to the regime, right? So why is it that church discipline doesn't have the kind of impact? Put aside the fact that it's not well practiced, but why does nobody fear disobeying the leaders of their own community? Well,
because they're not worried about going to hell if they get cast out of the church.
Well, there's that issue, but also they're not worried about, like, if I get cast out of the church, then there are very few social consequences to that in the broad culture.
Yes, exactly. No, a really good point.
Whereas if you live in a, like, Cryptos and I have the advantage of living in a community where, there's pretty high in-group preference. If you violate the rules of the community, your
it gets
entire
very
social
uncomfortable
network.
fast. Yeah, you lose your whole social network.
You got to go somewhere else. You got to go live in Toronto or something.
Yeah. That's not an understatement.
So, and that's the way that it has to be. You have to be able to, otherwise you can't. The community can't hold together, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think about this from the perspective of, in my sort of startup version of this, you're actively you're attempting to attract new people in to move into your geography, to commit to the project. And frankly, rigorous standards allows you to keep the wrong people out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I've been to some events in our sphere broadly defined, and it's a mixture of the most fantastic people, really sharp young guys, and guys that just they get absolutely smashed on the first night of the event, like embarrassingly drunk. And you need to be able to differentiate between the two. And that has so many knock-on effects. For example, regarding prestige, if you only let demonstrably excellent people in, that has this knock-on effect where everyone associates your sort of brand, for lack of a better word, with that level of excellence. And then it becomes an incredibly prestigious thing to be accepted into your order.
Well, this is how Beowulf built what Sargon called the most prestigious right-wing conference in England, right? By only accepting really excellent people.
Yes. I think BT has something that he wants to say. Did you want to chime in, BT?
Yeah, I was just going to hop in with something here really quick. First of all, it is nice to hear all of your guys' voices. But second of all, just kind of hopping on the subject here, isn't one of the things that we're evaluating here as far as building alternative communities, was one of them is that the prestige that the regime offers, like some of it is real and some of it is fake. So like, for example, in the article that we talked about that Johan wrote, which is a very good article, it's behind a paywall. Someone in the comments asked about that, but I will try to get a link after this really quickly. But he was, one of the things Johan is mentioning is he works, high up in these, how would you say, professional business organizations. And some of them actually bring material and economic wealth into the country, but there are other things the regime offers that are completely fake, like being a professor at a university that has no prestige anymore. And so part of building our prestige, shouldn't it be building our prestige in comparison to the regime's prestige?
Right, exactly. And you can also go one level down, right? Which is like, why do men want prestige? What are the rewards that they're angling for? And an example of that would obviously be money, but also an example of that would be women, right? You want to marry a perfect woman, broadly defined. And so one of the advantages that these communities, if set up properly, will have working in their favor is that their women will not be of the kind that you see so often on the modern street.
Yeah, there's really no elegant way to say that though. But it is, that we often joke. The university that I went to, Christian College. People often talk about going there to get their MRS degree, right? Your MR and your MRS, right?
Yeah.
So, and that,
there's nothing wrong with that. But
no, there isn't. No,
the issue is that it's an institute. The issue is that there should also be an elite institution, and there isn't.
That's right. But and the thing is that the reward for this, though, we talk about how much do we talk today about family formation, total fertility rate, and if you can look in a community and say like guys, girls, come here, get married, build a family. And we've put in place all of the pieces necessary to make that happen as a reward.
We've now discussed what we started the space with. So what are the rewards you can offer? Well, one of them is you can offer the opportunity to form genuine families. So there's one thing you can offer to people. You can also offer them the opportunity to participate in genuine male hierarchy. There's another thing you can offer. You can also offer them an opportunity for genuine, for legacy that continues on for more than one generation. Okay, there's another thing you can offer them. So we're going down the list of the ways in which you can persuade the excellent young men who will form the cornerstones of any such parallel community that they should participate there and not be sublimated into the broad culture, right? And in some ways, this is easier than it has ever been because the broad culture is declining in quality and declining in its ability to give rewards.
Hey, do you mind if I jump in right now?
Go ahead.
So the reason why I'm interested in this conversation is, well, first of all, I work for a right-wing organization, right? You're talking about all these organizations and values. But more importantly, you're talking about like all this high-level stuff about communities and building communities and how to govern society, basically. But from a more like individual, pragmatic level, not to make it about myself, but I'm feeling very lost right now because I left Canada to find somewhere new to build a life, basically, but there's no obvious answer to me. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you were me, what country would you go to?
Well, my view is you go to the geography in order to enhance the bandwidth of a connection you already had. You don't pick the geography before the belief system. This is going to sound very trite and unhelpful, but you need. My advice would be, if I was going to make a major international move, I would want to know exactly where I was moving and why. More than that, I would want confidence that my beliefs were genuinely aligned with the people that I was moving there with. I had a friend, for example, that had very romantic notions about living in the countryside. And he believed that this place he'd be moving to was this wild wilderness, sort of think Montana, Yellowstone, all that stuff. But instead it was a small agricultural land with smaller Republicans. And he felt incredibly isolated because he had nothing in common with these people, even though it was, politically speaking, a step closer from the big city to where he was politically. And so there's that primary question, and this is not going to be helpful if you're not religious, but I would definitely think about this in where is the purest form of my belief system expressed.
Yeah, well, one thing that the country that probably makes most sense for me is like Poland, but that's so far from my family, and I don't really want to learn Polish, and I feel like if I did move there, I wouldn't really fit in. So I don't know. I think maybe a red state might make more sense. I don't know. This is something I'm struggling with right now.
Well, and maybe coming from a different perspective, Chris, and I get that because I was one of these kids that moved away in part because I felt a call into the ministry, and that usually means leaving home, right? So I left home to go to school, crossed the border, and studied in the States. Then came back to Canada, but never really came home. And then about a decade later, when it was clear that ministry was taking a real terrible toll on me and the family and so forth, that I left the ministry. And then you have a question of, like you were facing, where do I go, right? And so we really liked the Christian school that the kids were in, but we really didn't know anybody there, right? And again, it was close to the church that I was leaving. So do you really get away then? Do you make a break then from the situation that you're leaving? And so we ended up deciding to come to a city where, my wife's sister lives, her best friend at the time lived, and her parents had just recently moved from the hometown closer to the sister, just because that, and so I had no idea what work was going to provide for me. But we made the choice to root ourselves and anchor ourselves in family, and then figured that the Lord would provide financially for us. And that ended up for us being the right decision that way in terms of how to anchor ourselves. And then now we've, 20 years later have I don't know if we've rooted ourselves in the community, but our kids are now very much rooted in this community, which is really kind of the goal.
I mean, this is what I was getting at with creating a spiritual bond between you and a people, between a leadership class and a people. This is not like a 2-year project where you go and plant yourself somewhere new and then everything's going to be okay. That's just not how that works. You're going to need to, I come from a I was born into a community of Anglo-Canadians that just doesn't exist anymore. And so if you're going to join a new community in a deep and profound way, you're talking about like a 20-year investment in a particular people, a particular place. You're probably going to have to marry into the community. You might, like, there are fundamental, this is not something you're going to accomplish quickly. And so you need to make very deliberate choices. And not only that, they're not going to accept you immediately as one of their leaders. That's not the way this works, and it shouldn't be the way it works.
No, you're probably still the new guy 20 years later, but your kids
That's
are okay.
right.
You know?
Your kids might be okay. And so, like, when you're thinking about either founding or entering into one of these communities, you need to understand that you're coming in as an outsider. Whether that's fair or not, that's the way it is, right?
Well, and you look at that, the Doug Wilson thing. Like, you know, he's taking over something that his father started 40 years ago, and now it's bearing fruit of a seed that was planted 40 years ago. But go ahead, I interrupted somebody.
No, I was going to say, you know, in some sense, the richer a community you're moving into is, necessarily the more alien it is, right? Because it's more particular, it's more authentic, it's more rooted in a place that you haven't grown up. And so in some sense, you know, the richer the thing that you're reaching out towards, the more you must want it, because the greater the barriers to overcome will be. Those of us that have grown up in cities and have sort of traveled, quote unquote, all over the world, but really just been to major metropolises all over the world, sometimes underappreciate just how alien a place 5 miles out can actually be if it's functioning properly as it should be. And so in some sense, to overcome all the costs that will be associated with this transition, exactly as Black Horse and Krupler said, you need an over-romantic vision of what you're moving into, such that you can deal with that pain and that isolation, especially if you're a writer that's sitting alone. You know, you're not joining a company. You're sitting alone in your office or your WeWork or whatever every day writing. You need an incredibly romantic vision and an enduringly romantic vision of where you're moving to and why you are moving there in order to make that incredibly long-term and deep investment to overcome those barriers.
I guess I don't have that vision. One way that I'm thinking of going about it is I'm trying to find a wife, but I'm not sure if it makes sense to like find a wife and move to where she is, or like move somewhere, plant my roots, and then like once you have roots, it's much easier to find somebody. There's no real answers to these questions. Like I don't have the vision that you're talking about, so I have to try to figure out how to find a vision.
But it's good though, Chris, that you asked the question though, because you're not the only one who has this question, right? And I have a similar question, but in different ways, in a sense of like, I'm part of one of these communities, and yet I still struggle with the idea of, you know, how do we found the community as currently constituted isn't resisting the regime, so to speak, right? Not actively or consciously. If it's doing by accident. And so this question of either you start something separate or you awaken the people that are there, but having, you know, worked on institutional change, as one of the reasons why I left ministry is that, you know, institutional change is hard, right? And especially if you have a community with a certain kind. So even in my situation, I get the sense that even anchored in a traditional ethno-religious community, that there's still the prospect of you're going to have to branch out and start something on its own. And like as Johan says, something with, you know, high barriers of entry, high values that is able to offer rewards, and so forth. But at a certain point in time, we have to begin to talk about it, so that way we can sort of fix in our mind, like, okay, what are we doing? Right. And I think that this is why in a discussion like this is so very important, even among a handful of us, is that it gets the topic out there. And I think it's something that I think is worthwhile revisiting again and again. And then, you know, filtering out through the networks, the existing networks that we have, because somebody will catch the vision. And then, you know, as I say, we're looking at probably a multi-generational project. Right. And that's, I think, the way that we have to conceive it. This is not a 5-year startup or a 3-year startup. This is a multi-generational project that will begin and will bear fruit for our grandchildren, hopefully.
Well, one thing to hop in here really quick, it being a multi-generational project, there's really no way to make a multi-generational project and just have it be a bunch of people who have, vaguely right-wing beliefs or Christian beliefs even in common. The best way to do it is through the family. So just to give an example, like, I'm from Washington State. I'm somewhere else right now, but I'm from Washington State. And, for me, like I would never leave Washington, even though it's politically almost as bad as Canada. But it's like I'm there to build my life there with my family, with my parents and with my siblings, and hopefully with my future wife. And so it's much easier to build communities if you have a familial aspect to it. Like if there's 4 generations and they've lived in one town for years, then it makes it much easier to create these alternative communities. The family is the easiest way to do this. So if your family's not on board with like Christianity and right-wing beliefs, at least vaguely right-wing beliefs or sentiments rather, then it's going to be much harder to build a giant multi-generational project like this.
Yeah, that's kind of my situation. My family are all like far left Canadians. I moved to Europe like a couple months ago, or like a month ago, and I think the first thing I realized is that I don't think it really makes sense for me to settle in Europe. Like just if for no other reason, it's my parents are in North America.
Yeah.
And so like it kind of makes much more sense for me to be in a like red state in America, just so like I can be near my parents.
Yeah. Well, you have a tough job. And so I think what our friend Lafayette Lee would say is to become the patriarch of your family, which is a giant undertaking, obviously. And, not that I'm in a position to give advice, but I feel like that's what he would say if he was here, which is that if you don't have that community, you kind of have to pray and create it.
Now, I for those that Johan and I had talked about this, but I do have some time restraints, and I have to head out in about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm wondering, Johan, did you have a final word that you would like to offer to everybody before we head out?
No, well, I think Big Tuna's reference to the patriarchy is the right one. This is a really grand mission ahead of all of us.
Yeah.
I think, Chris, one thing that I would advise against is finding a woman and moving to her, because what all of us are called to do in this situation is really to be leaders and founders and pioneers, and to be patriarchs in the fullest sense of the word. And by you're slightly mixing up your decision stack by I'm moving to the woman at the front of that. So I think that's probably the wrong mindset to pursue. Instead, it should be one of the sort of boldness of taking risks, of going out into uncharted territory, of putting yourself on the line, and setting up a project that might fail. It might fail spectacularly. It might hurt other people when it fails because you brought them with you. But these are the risks that this situation calls for us to take, and we just need a good enough reason to take them, and a good mission, a good sense of service as to what we're actually trying to achieve.
Well, again, thank you, Johan, for making time. I know with the time difference, this has been a challenge, but it's good. And I really think I'd like to do this again sometime, because I think we really just got started on the whole topic. And I think now that we've said some things, it will help us to think further on this and maybe do some writing, and then come back and revisit this again down the road sometime. And thank you to everybody who has showed up and listened. And unfortunately, we couldn't, it's just hard in a space to open up to questions and so forth. So that may be one of these things that we'll have to work on and address in the future, is how to open up to more broadly to just general questions. But anyways, again, this will also be for those that wish to leave in, just because the time it takes to download and to reformat it and everything, in 2 or 3 days, probably it will show up on my Substack, Seeking the Hidden Thing, for those that would like to listen to the full thing that maybe missed the first half or so forth. Anyways, thank you, and thank you all, guys, and we will see you later.